people can really struggle with real-life perspective-taking. And we know that in the neurotypical population, bilingualism seems to stimulate perspective-taking, at least in childhood. In adulthood, it's very unclear. We don't really know if there's a positive influence, and some studies find no effect at all. So I want to try and understand this relationship in autism. So now maybe you're thinking, wait a second, bilingualism and autism, but can autistic people even be bilingual? Yes, they can. But the problem is that currently in the literature, we have only 2 profiles of autistic bilingual people. So either the savant polyglot who knows loads of languages, or the autistic child who grew up in a bilingual family. And for all of these fields of research, we mostly have the experience of these parents of autistic child or the practitioners. And actually what we see mostly is that the parents are generally very worried about keeping bilingualism with their autistic child, and mostly based on the advice of practitioners to drop bilingualism entirely. So basically, the current framework for my research is not so great. So that's where my research comes in. I want to understand whether bilingualism influences social cognition in autism as it seems to be doing in neurotypical people. And I want to do this every step of the way, going from those social habits to perspective-taking abilities down to the brain networks supporting perspective-taking. So my first study was first just to understand very broadly what was going on, and I designed an online questionnaire for autistic monolingual and bilingual adults. With this study, I had 2 main questions. First, how do autistic people become bilingual? Are there really only these 2 types of autistic bilingual people, the polyglot and the early bilingual autistic child? And then, does bilingualism shape the social life of autistic people? And if so, how? So I used the autism and bilingualism census. So I got in total 299 respondents, which was about 270 more than what I was hoping. And I got 89 monolinguals, 99 bilinguals, and 110 multilinguals, so people with 3 languages or more. And the main finding here is that there is such a huge diversity of language profiles in this population. Here I just put the age of acquisition of the 2nd and 3rd languages and the overall proficiency in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd languages. But as you can see, even just for the age of acquisition, the acquisition of a 2nd or 3rd language can occur basically at any point during the life. And same for proficiency. People, sometimes some of them are very proficient in 2 to 3 languages, and some are just proficient in 1 and not so proficient in the other. So as I said, a huge diversity of profiles that is not currently represented in the literature. Now for my second question, does bilingualism shape in any sort of way the self-rated social life quality of autistic adults? And if so, how? And I found that, so I did stepwise regression analysis with all the bilingualism variables that I had collected to try and see whether any of them did anything in terms of predicting social life quality. And using the entire sample of participants, I saw that actually the number of languages significantly predicted the social life quality ratings. And that was by grouping the participants as monolingual, bilingual, and multilingual. So basically, multilinguals rated their social life quality as more satisfying than monolinguals. So these findings just showed that there seemed to be something, a sort of relationship between social life and social processes and bilingualism. So then, second step, understanding whether bilingualism could stimulate perspective taking. But as I said, even in neurotypical people, it was not very clear how things were working. So I basically conducted this step twice, once in a neurotypical population to understand how it was working in a typical setting, and a second time in an autistic sample. So the problem with most of the current studies in the relationship between bilingualism and perspective taking in neurotypical people is that they see bilingualism as one thing and perspective taking as one thing. While, as I said in the introduction, bilingualism is characterized by many different features and perspective taking occurs in many different ways. Basically, what is going on? is there a particular feature of bilingualism that influences perspective taking? And are all of the forms of perspective taking sensitive to bilingualism or only some of them? And I wanted to answer this question so in the neurotypical population, in typical development, and in autistic people. So to answer this question, I used several tasks. So first, a demographic and language questionnaire to collect all the variables about bilingualism, like the age of acquisition of the language, the proficiency, the switching experience, as well as the age of the participants as a control variable. And for other control variables, I also had the test of everyday attention to measure executive function, especially sustained attention, inhibition, and attention switching, as well as the WASI-2 to measure nonverbal IQ. And then for perspective taking, so first, visual perspective taking. That one is a bit tricky, so bear with me. So this was a computerized task with 4 different conditions. So first, level 1 perspective taking, so whether or not the avatar could see an item, here a little ball. And you had consistent trials where all the balls were in front of the avatar, so the participant and the avatar could see the same number of balls. And inconsistent trials where some of the balls were behind the avatar, so the participant could see more balls than the avatar. Then for level 2 perspective taking, it was about how the avatar could see the item. And here it was with a digit placed on a table in front of the avatar. So for consistent trials, the digit was standing up on the table. So here both the participant and the avatar could see a 9. And for inconsistent trials, the digit was flat on the table. So here, for example, you can see a 6 while the avatar sees a 9. And the trials were constructed just like this. So first they had a perspective cue, so you or avatar, and then a number cue. So for level 1 trial, it was 0, 1, 2, or 3 for the number of balls. And for level 2 trials, 6 or 9. And then the picture, and participants had to press yes or no to say whether the picture matched the cues. So here, for example, can you see a 6? No, you can see a 9 on the table. So basically we had these 4 conditions for level 1, level 2, consistent, inconsistent, each time with trials where you had to take your perspective, self trials, and when you had to take the avatar perspective, avatar trials. And actually what you find is that in terms of response time, inconsistent trials are significantly longer than consistent trials. And that is considered as reflecting a bias, a sort of automatic, unintentional processing of the other perspective, even though you don't have to do it. So in self-trials, where you have to process your own perspective, when you take longer in inconsistent trials, it is seen as an altocentric bias, and you sort of automatically unintentionally process the perspective of the other, of the avatar. And then for avatar trials, when you have to process the avatar perspective, if you take longer in inconsistent trials, it is seen as an egocentric bias. You unintentionally process your own perspective as well, even though you're not supposed to do it, and that slows you down. And basically, I wanted to see whether bilingualism influenced these unintentional, automatic visual perspective-taking processes. Then for cognitive and affective perspective-taking, I used a video-based task, the Adult Theory of Mind task that I extended. So this task includes short videos that last 30 seconds to 1 minute of social interactions, and they are followed by questions. So you have 6 physical control videos that are followed by a physical question, such as, why did the boy win the race? And then you had 6 social videos, each followed by 5 questions. So the original question was very general. For example, why did Anna say this? And then I added level 1 and level 2 cognitive and affective questions to specifically measure the things I was interested in. So for example, level 1 cognitive was, what does Lucy think? Level 2, what does Lucy think Bob thinks? And same for affective. So what does Lucy feel? And what does Lucy think Bob feels? And then participants had 30 seconds to answer these questions one by one, and then these answers were coded and scored 0, 1, or 2 points. And then for each participant, the scores were averaged across all 6 videos. So I ended up with a control physical score ranging from 0 to 2, and then a general score, the original score of the task, a level 1 cognitive, level 2 cognitive, overall cognitive, level 1 affective, level 2 affective, overall affective, and overall social score. And then I built loads of regression models using a stepwise method to try and see whether any bilingualism variable predicted these perspective-taking scores above and beyond of control measures such as executive function, nonverbal IQ, or age. So first, for the neurotypical group, I got 96 bilingual neurotypical adults. These are their demographics. I aged about 28 years, mostly female with a slightly above average IQ. And these are some representations of their bilingualism profiles. And most importantly, here you see that even though the age of acquisition of L2 was in one of my predictors, as it happens in my sample, actually, all my participants had acquired their second language before age 15. So I had very low hopes for this variable because I figured that I didn't have enough viability for this particular measure, but I kept it in anyways. So just a quick visual representation of the outcome measures, just for you to see that there was indeed no ceiling effect or floor effect in the data. So these are the visual biases in level 1 and level 2, egocentric and altocentric biases. And these were the cognitive and affective perspective-taking scores. But now we're going to move on directly to our main question. So does bilingualism predict perspective-taking? And if so, what is going on? And this table is a summary of all of these models. So I'm going to walk you through these tables. So basically in columns here, you have all the outcome measures. So the 4 visual perspective-taking measures, then the 3 cognitive perspective-taking, the 3 affective perspective-taking, and then the more general scores here, and the control physical score for the video task. And in column, it is their own respective models. The rows are the predictors, so the bilingualism predictors, the control predictors, and then at the bottom, the indicators of the models with the variance explained, the p-value, the effect size, and the post-hoc power. So all the predictors that were selected in the final most optimal model are here colored in blue if they were selected but not significant, and green if they were selected and significant. And there's a plus if they were positively predicted, if they were negatively predicting the outcome measure. And here for the p-value, it's in blue if the model was not a significant predictor of the outcome measure, and green if the model was significant. And the main thing to see here is that actually, in spite of the fact that I had not that much viability in my sample, the most frequently selected predictor was the age of acquisition of the second language in terms of bilingualism. And also importantly, we can see here that it was not selected more than once in the visual models, but it was frequently selected for the cognitive and affective modalities. So it seems to show that these modalities are more susceptible to the effect of bilingualism than the visual modality. And also importantly, we see that the effect of bilingualism is that of the L2 age is that it negatively predicts the perspective-taking scores, showing that a younger age of acquisition of L2 was linked with higher cognitive and affective perspective-taking scores above and beyond any effect of age or nonverbal IQ or executive skills. So that is basically the main result. Executive skills was involved in all the modalities of perspective taking, and the age of acquisition of the second language was involved only in cognitive and affective perspective taking. So now, do we find the same thing in autism, or does it work differently in autism? So I recruited 39 autistic bilingual adults. It is not a very big sample, but it is actually quite tricky to recruit autistic bilingual people in Scotland. So this is a short summary of their demographics. They were aged on average 35 years, and they had an above average IQ. So again, this is a quick representation of their bilingualism profiles. And again, actually, in terms of age of acquisition of the second language, all of them except one outlier that was removed acquired their second language before age 15. So again, I had very low hopes for this variable, but I kept it in anyways. Again, these are some quick visual representation of the outcome measures in terms of visual perspective taking, and here cognitive and affective perspective taking scores. And now let's move on directly to our question, what is going on? Again, this is a summary table of all the models with, again, all the models summarized in columns. So the first four are the visual perspective taking models, then cognitive, affective, and more general social perspective taking processes. And again, the bilingualism predictors here at the top rows, then the control predictors and the indicators of the models. And what we see here again is that the most frequently selected predictor is the age of acquisition of the second language, even though actually we had very low viability for this particular variable. Again, we see that it doesn't seem to be very much involved in visual processes, but it was frequently selected for bilingual, for cognitive and affective models. And again, we see the same relationship that early bilingualism seems to be predicting higher cognitive and affective perspective taking scores. So this was the main finding for the autistic sample. This time, executive skills seems to be mostly related to visual perspective taking and not so much with cognitive and affective perspective taking. And the age of acquisition of the second language predicted cognitive and affective perspective taking. So now that I saw that, I wanted to see what happened in the brain. So I conducted an fMRI study with autistic and neurotypical bilingual adults, because we saw that at the behavioral level, early bilingualism stimulated the development of perspective taking, both in neurotypical and autistic adults, with a long-lasting effect, because we could even measure this effect in adulthood. So this early bilingualism also changed the way the brain works during perspective taking. So I recruited a subsample of the previously recruited neurotypical and autistic participants, but this time only targeted early and late bilinguals. So I had very small samples for this one, with 7 to 9 participants in each group. Importantly, we have to see that in the overall neurotypical sample and overall autistic sample, they were actually identical in terms of chronological age, gender distribution, nonverbal IQ, and in all the bilingualism measures like number of languages reported, age of acquisition of the second language, or proficiency in the second language. As expected, autistic people scored much higher than neurotypical people in terms of the autism quotient score. The task that I used was a simple cartoon-based perspective-taking task with 3 cartoons presented one after the other to build up a story, and at the end there were 2 cartoons side by side, and the participants had to choose which cartoon was the best ending to the story. So you had 3 conditions: the affective condition, where the participants had to make a decision based on the emotional reaction and behavior of one of the 2 protagonists. The cognitive condition, it was the same. The participants had to make a decision based on the thoughts or goal or intention or belief of one of the 2 protagonists. And then a controlled physical condition where, for example, here, when you drop a vase, it does not bounce on the floor, it breaks. So that was the sort of decision that participants had to make. So what I found, first I looked at the overall brain activation during the task. And here you see in blue regions that were more activated in late bilinguals compared to early bilinguals. And in yellow, just a tiny bit in some places where early bilinguals activated more than late bilinguals. So we mostly see a widespread overactivation in late bilinguals compared to early bilinguals. But actually, when you looked at the accuracy or mean response time during the task, early and late bilinguals were identical. So that could suggest a sort of higher processing efficiency in early bilinguals compared to late bilinguals. And then I wanted to see whether bilingualism influenced the activity specifically linked with cognitive perspective taking or affective perspective taking. And I didn't find anything related to affective perspective taking, but I found an interaction between the bilingualism group and the specific activity during cognitive perspective taking in one tiny area in the right anterior cingulate cortex, here in orange. And so that could suggest that cognitive, at least in terms of neuroactivity, maybe cognitive perspective taking is more sensitive to early bilingualism than affective perspective taking. So then I wanted to see whether this influence of bilingualism on the activity in the right anterior cingulate cortex during cognitive perspective taking was different in autistic compared to neurotypical participants. So I extracted the activation in this area, and I did a very simple ANOVA with bilingualism and diagnosis as factors. And I found that indeed early bilinguals had a lower cognitive specific activation in this region compared to late bilinguals. So here we see that in the light yellow and light blue compared to darker yellow and darker blue. And I also found that autistic participants had a smaller cognitive specific activation in this region compared to neurotypical participants. So the yellow were lower than the blue. But very importantly, I found no interaction between the bilingualism group and the diagnosis. So that would suggest that autism does not modify the effect of early bilingualism in the right anterior cingulate cortex during a cognitive perspective taking task. So let's summarize everything. So first, I find in my study that there was a huge diversity of language and bilingualism profiles in autism that are absolutely not represented in the literature at the moment. I found as well that in terms of overall perceived self-rated social life quality, there was indeed a relationship between bilingualism and social life quality in autistic adults. Then in terms of cognitive abilities, I found that apparently only cognitive and affective perspective taking seem to be sensitive to bilingualism, but not visual perspective taking. And I found that this effect of bilingualism seemed to be developmental, with the effect being driven by the age of acquisition of the second language, and that it was long lasting and still visible in adulthood. And very importantly here, I found that this relationship between bilingualism and perspective taking seemed to be very similar between typical development and autistic development. And finally, I found that in terms of brain activity during perspective taking, indeed there were strong differences between early and late bilinguals, reflecting what was found at the behavioral level. And again, just as at the behavioral level, it seemed that in terms of neuroactivity, the influence of early bilingualism was similar in neurotypical and autistic adults. And that's it. Thank you. Now, do you have questions, comments, doubts? Raise your hands. I have no idea how to check if people are having questions.
I can check in the chat, but I'm sure they'll, they'll just, if you want to ask any questions, just unmute yourself. Thanks a lot for the presentation. It was great.
Thank you. It was heavy, so I hope you're not all like crushed under the quantity of data.
So any questions?
It was really good. Well done. You'll be fine.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have like a simple question that I'm sure they'll probably ask you in some way or another.
Yeah.
What do you think are some limitations of the research, or at least like the largest limitation?
So, I mean, there are loads. So, for example, in terms of the bilingualism measures that I've used as predictors, they were all self-reported. So already in there, you can have strong differences between people in terms of what they think, for example, is a good proficiency or a low proficiency in the language.
Yeah.
So, and this predictor proficiency did not come up in any model, but it could be also mostly because people are not very reliably able to assess their own proficiency. Same for the age of acquisition, it was retrospective. So people might have difficulties to assess their own age of acquisition for each language. So now that my study seems to be showing that there is something going on in terms of the relationship between bilingualism and perspective taking, it would be very important to reproduce this, but by using for example, a proficiency test to reliably assess proficiency in all of the languages, or at least in the first and second language, and potentially to really assess the developmental effect of bilingualism, more having a longitudinal study to really see whether people acquiring their second language later, indeed in adulthood, show lower perspective taking scores. So all these things of more rigorous assessment of the bilingualism variables, such as proficiency, I was not able to do because I didn't really know what I would be working with in terms of language profiles. So ideally, I would have liked to choose specific languages and specific language profiles, and then I would have been able to assess them using standardized tests. But because I knew I would not be able to do it for the autistic group, because it was already complex enough to recruit them, yep. I didn't do it for the neurotypical group. But indeed, that's definitely something that has to be assessed more rigorously. Yeah, that's one strong thing. Another limitation as well, in terms of, for example, not finding an effect of bilingualism on visual processes. For visual processes, actually, my outcome measure was an implicit process, while for the cognitive and affective measures, they were explicit processes. So yep. Maybe it was more of, the difference was not a difference of modality, but a difference of explicitness of the process.
Okay, well, that sounds great. It sounds like you've thought about it a lot, about the limitations and how you could address these. So it's good.
Yeah, in the thesis it is covered at length.
Yeah, I can imagine. Great. Does anyone have any other questions?
Or like comments, or I'm even going like beyond what I exactly talked about. Because for example, I remember that in one of my oral presentations, Sue asked me, well, if you find an effect in terms of neuroactivity, but no effect in terms of cognition, or no effect in terms of social life quality, what would you recommend to parents? And I mean, to me, what we find in terms of behavior or neuroactivity is not as important as the lived experiences of the participants. And what was very interesting is that in the first questionnaire, actually, in the online study, there were also open-ended questions where I just asked the participants what they felt about being bilingual. And very interestingly, they all, I mean, many of them, almost all of them, mentioned things like having access to the wider autistic community, having access to more information, having access to more job opportunities, just like neurotypical people, basically. And I find that in the end, their experiences are more relevant than any cognitive effect I could find of bilingualism.
Yeah, it's great that you could gather all this data as well on lived experiences.
I
Hello?
haven't finished analyzing it yet. Yes?
I wonder if I could just ask, when can I access this recording so I can listen to it all again and see if I can understand it better the second time?
So I think we'll be uploading it on our YouTube channel. So I'll send it around in the Psychiatry Journal Club mailing list. It will probably be a week or so.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I guess this is the end of the Journal Club. So best of luck. I'm sure you'll do great.
Thank you.
In your Viva, and we'll hopefully celebrate once all this lockdown is over.
Yes.
So next week we have Donald Lyle from the University of Glasgow, and his title is Genetic Contributions to Structural Brain and Cognitive Phenotypes. So thank you again, and I'll see everyone next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great job, Berengere.
Thank you.